Okay, so today in this lesson, I want to talk about how to choose a mouthpiece if you're a single reed instrument. So applies to both clarinet and saxophone. So there's a bunch of different things to look at when choosing a mouthpiece as a single reed player. The first one I want to talk about is tip opening. So when we talk about what the tip opening basically means is the distance between where the reed and the tip of the mouthpiece. So it's that distance between the tip of the reed and the tip of the mouthpiece. And the bigger that is, the harder it will be to control, but also the bigger the sound is going to be than a smaller tip opening. Smaller tip openings are easier to control, but they also have more problems with the sound can kind of get pinched off at the top because there's not enough room for the mouthpiece to vibrate. And usually smaller tip openings, you need a harder reed, and bigger tip openings, you need a softer reed. So in terms of clarinet and alto and tenor saxophones, the most common tip openings on clarinet range from like 0.035 to like 0.050, I think, is about the range for clarinet mouthpieces. And that just is I think a tip opening is the millimeter size of the tip opening. And then alto saxophone mouthpieces can range anywhere from 0.060 to about 0.090. 0.009 is pretty big. This is what this Van Doren mouthpiece is. And obviously classical mouthpieces are going to be smaller and jazz mouthpieces are going to be bigger. The average size for a jazz alto mouthpiece is around a 0.075. For a classical, it's about 0.062 or 3. Then tenor mouthpieces can go from probably 0.095 or 100 all the way up to like 120 or 130. And again, the average is about 0.105. And those correspond usually with numbers like 5, 6, 7. But when you go to buy a mouthpiece, you can pretty much look at it and be able to tell, or it'll tell you 7 equals 0.100 or 8 star equals 0.115. So, the numbers aren't really as useful. If you get the actual measurement, then that's more consistent because the numbers aren't consistent within each brand. So next thing I want to talk about is the shape and the size of the chamber. So a lot of times they throw around terms like small chamber, medium chamber, large chamber. Well, what do those things mean? Basically, it means what it says. It's a small chamber means chamber is small, medium is medium, and large is large. But what does that mean for your sound? So a small chamber is definitely going to give you a brighter sound. And then the larger it goes, the darker it's going to get. Because the darkness to brightness scale has to do with how fast the air is traveling. And so if you can get a mouthpiece that makes the air travel faster, it'll sound brighter, and vice versa. If the chamber is bigger, if the air's going slower, it'll sound darker. And so small chambers are going to give you a bright sound. Large chambers are going to give you a dark sound. Medium is going to give you a little bit right in the middle. The more important one, or at least just as important as the chamber, is the size and shape and of the baffle. So the baffle is the area of material that is just past the tip. So if I can show you, the baffle is going to be right here. That's where you're going to have your baffle. And this one doesn't have much of a baffle, but here, this one does. This is one of my tenor mouthpieces. See that baffle, that wedge right there? That's what the baffle is. And so that determines how fast the air is traveling too, because if there's a higher baffle in there, there's less space for the air to travel, and it'll go faster. And again, faster air means brighter, slower air means darker. Now, there's different chamber and baffle combinations that companies can make and do to try to get their mouthpieces to have a different kind of characteristic. And in my experience, the baffle, like a mouthpiece with a high baffle versus a mouthpiece with a small chamber, gives it a different kind of brightness. I can't exactly describe what that means, but it's just a little bit of a different quality depending on what and obviously there's all sorts of other things about the mouthpiece too that make a difference, sidewalls and all that, but that's a little bit more complicated. The next one I want to talk about is the facing curve. So basically what the facing curve means is where on the bottom of the mouthpiece does the reed meet the mouthpiece. So if you've ever obviously you guys have put your reeds on your mouthpieces, there's a spot where you can see the reed starts to touch the mouthpiece. And that is kind of the facing curve, which is, if it's a shorter facing curve, that means the reed meets the mouthpiece way in the front. If it's longer, it means the reed meets the mouthpiece way in the back. And that has a lot to do with the response of the mouthpiece and the playing characteristics of how it feels. Not necessarily how it sounds, but how controllable it is and how comfortable it is to play. Usually shorter facing curves are harder to play than longer ones, but, to each his own. A lot of jazz mouthpieces have a little bit longer facing curves, I think. Next topic is tip rail and side rails. And these kind of also have to do with the way the mouthpiece plays, not necessarily the sound. They can be thick or they can be thin, but usually thin side rails and thin tip rails means that mouthpieces are going to be more free blowing, and you're going to need to use harder reeds. And the thicker tip rails kind of mean that it's going to be a little bit more resistant, usually in my experience. So I have two different mouthpieces here to show you. This one is my Selmer C Star, and this one's a Retro Revival 7th Avenue South, which is basically a Gardala copy mouthpiece. And so I want to show you the difference here between the tip rails of these two mouthpieces. So if you can see with the C Star, you can see how much thicker it is than the Retro Revival, which also almost has no tip rail whatsoever. It's almost just a shelf. All right? And that kind of also, again, it determines how the mouthpiece plays more than the sound of it. So the last two things you probably want to consider with these kinds of mouthpieces is what type of instrument are you playing and what type of music you play. So for the instrument, I play these Yamaha horns, the Yamaha Custom Z silver horns, which tend to be on the brighter spectrum. So sometimes when I have a really, really bright mouthpiece on a really, really bright horn, it just gets, it's so loud that it's not worth it. So I tend to play mouthpieces that are more in the medium to medium bright area to kind of compensate for it. Or even just straight up like this mouthpiece I'm playing here, this other one, Theowani Gaia mouthpiece is kind of right in the middle. But the horn brightens up the sound a little bit, and so I can kind of have a medium bright sound. And the opposite is true. You might have to go with a brighter mouthpiece if you're playing something like a P. Moriot or an old Mark VI or a SBA or something that is going to be really, really dark. So that's something to check on too, is to make sure that not only the mouthpiece suits you, it suits what you're playing. And then also what style of music you're playing is really important. So if you're playing jazz, if you're playing traditional jazz, classic, bebop and stuff, you probably don't want to have a super, super bright contemporary, metal mouthpiece usually. But if you are playing that kind of stuff, then you want to have something that's brighter and more projection, with more projection. And if you're playing classical, then you probably just want to have a nice classical mouthpiece like a Van Doren AL3 or a Selmer C Star or anything like that. And it also depends on who you listen to and what your sound concept is and all that. And it's, for clarinet and saxophone too. So that's also important. But if I was just going to get my first jazz mouthpiece, I would just think of what's cost effective, what is made well, and what's going to give me a something that's in the middle of bright and dark. It's not going to be so dark that I can't project, and it's not so bright that you can't play anything else, so that you can figure out what kind of sound you want and then go from there. So the last thing I want to talk about is hard rubber versus metal. And there's always a debate on which one's better. Is hard rubber better or is metal better? And does it really even make a difference? Some people say, no, the material makes no difference, which is not true. It does. In my experience, the material definitely makes a difference on how dark or bright it is in the sound characteristics. Definitely, in my experience, hard rubber mouthpieces are very much darker than metal mouthpieces, even those that are sort of the same idea of mouthpiece. Like, take these two tenor mouthpieces I have. This one is a Theowani Durga, the one I showed you with the baffle. This one is an Arnold Montgomery Katana, and this is an 8, and this one's a 9. They almost have the same or a very similar baffle profile, if you can see. They have a similar structure to it, but this mouthpiece plays 2 order of magnitudes darker than the Durga does for me. Simply, probably just because of probably the chamber, but also, I mean, the material just doesn't ring as much. So, if I were just, again, getting a new mouthpiece, I would probably stay away from metal, because usually metal is hard to control, and hard rubber is going to give you a little bit of a warmer, more controllable sound. And then if you want to get something metal later, you can. Wrong with me. And for alto, usually metal is not as accepted for whatever reason on tenor. You can get away with playing metal on tenor because tenor is naturally a darker sound, but alto, usually the metal mouthpieces just make it really bright and cutting, and there's very few instances where that's even appropriate. So, but that is an overview on all the different terms associated with single reed mouthpieces. And if you guys have any questions, leave them in the comments. I'm going to make another video soon about ligatures too, because those are also important, although not as important as the mouthpiece. But there's certainly little quirks about ligatures that you guys need to know. So I'll see you in the next one. Thanks.